So today we are going to take a look at Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein. I hope I pronounced that right. It was awarded one of 88 books that shaped America by the Library of Congress. It's a fairly big and popular book. It was amongst like one of my very favorite books and a book I would recommend. I hadn't read it in a while. I reread it. I still enjoyed it, but it didn't quite have the same luster as it did before. What I feel this book does is, in addition to being like a narrative story that's interesting, is it raises a lot of questions. So the basic plot is there's a man from Mars, and he is born on Mars, but he's human. There was a human ship that got sent to Mars. Like all the crew, I think, die, except they had a baby, and this baby was raised by Martians. And these Martians are beings that are a lot more ephemeral, relative to like humans, and long thinking. They don't die, they just discorporate, and their consciousness remains with the rest of the Martians. And so it's a much different angle that this man from Mars is coming from. I forget his name in the book. And he comes to Earth and he is trying to understand humanity, and it is through his attempt to understand humanity that a lot of questions get raised, as well as a narrative that's pretty entertaining. And so the questions perhaps like that get exposed or asked is like the nature of like human relationships and intimacy, which is like one of the reasons this book was like banned in a couple spots, because there is a bit of a free love commune in parts of the book, so it was very scandalous at the time. It was published in 1961. And so you have this notion of Grok, which means literally to drink. It's a Martian word. And it is also means to understand, to love, and to be one with. And so, like, as far as, novelty or usefulness comes from, I think, like, this, like, word itself, or, like, this concept is actually interesting and thought-provoking. And so it's up there for that. Then we have it also, a lot of it takes a look at religion as well, and especially in the like later half of the book. And I don't think there's a good way for me to spoil this without or to talk about it without spoiling, so I guess you'll just have to take my word that it discusses religion, but in a way that is I think simultaneously like asking questions, but also like being respectful or reverent, or at least somewhat. I guess there's one religion that is very irreverent and is a caricature of like a synthesis between like a capitalist money grab scheme as well as like an organized religion. And so this is perhaps like a bit of a disrespect, but the overall arc is one that is maybe looking at like unifying. Okay, I'll just go with it. Like at some point there becomes this church of all religions, and the idea is that like every religion is right, and so like it's interesting. So it was published in the 60s, and rereading it now, I am bothered by some things that I wasn't bothered like last time I read it, which was like 10 years ago, which is like there's some like misogynistic undertones that for the most part are pretty easy to ignore and dismiss on the context of like, look, it was written in the 60s, and I think you should just judge authors within the context that they were written, you know, like I think for the 60s, or for the early 60s, 61, this was fairly progressive. But then you get hit with like some lines where like I forget the exact, I can't quote it exactly, but like it's one of the females is like says that like 9 out of 10 rapes are like the victim is blameworthy for, and I'm just like all right. Also like the female characters are a little more stale / wallflowery than the male characters in regards to like development or importance, but they're still like fairly important, and there's like a lot of them. It's not like Lord of the Rings, where there's not a lot of, well, actually I shouldn't, it's been a while since I've read the books. I shouldn't talk about it. The movies have like basically very little with women. Anyways, tangent on Lord of the Rings. So just that one like aspect, I found a little bit annoying, I guess. Also, it being published in the '60s and being sci-fi, it's tremendously interesting to read the like the futuristic technology of like 60 years ago, where like they still think like reading the newspaper is like a thing. It's just like an easier way of reading the newspaper, where it like scrolls past your eye and like you turn off like the teletype or whatever it's called, and then like just like so many things, pieces of technology where you're like, wow, this isn't even like that advanced, and it's supposed to be like of the future back then. So like that part's really interesting, but I think you get that from any science fiction book. Let's jump into the ratings. So for utility, I give it a 2. It's maybe it deserves actually a little bit higher than a 2, because I think that the notion of Grok is a bit interesting, like philosophically. It's not interesting in a sort of like sense where I think it like accurately describes the world, but I think it's like worthwhile considering your relationships through this like lens, I suppose, of trying to grok other people. And I don't know if I would say that that's like the best lens, but just like having it in your like toolbox of ways of looking at things is a bit useful. For novelty, I gave it a 4, largely on the back of like the grokking thing, as well as it also being a pretty popular book, and this is like kind of points up for utility as well. It's a fairly popular book, so just like knowing about it helps with like pop culture references and stuff a little bit. It's still like written like 60 years ago, and it's like really not a big deal if you don't read it at all. But there are some interesting ideas in there that I think are thought-provoking, and it's like it's easy to read, even though I think it's like 400-ish pages. Yeah, it's like 400 pages. It's like a novel type thing. It's a storybook, so it's easy to read. For entertainment, I gave it a 9. Still very enjoyable to read, despite my like reservations about some parts. For style, I gave it an 8. There's a lot of points that are like very amusing, and like the author does a good job, and it's very entertaining in that way. And I think there's like no parts that are like stale or droning on or like this type of stuff, which is like just terrible in any type of novel. And it's just it's fairly fast paced and interesting. For getting into the other ones, readability, I gave it an 8. It's not difficult to read. I suppose there are some like some discussions that get abstract and philosophical between characters, and so like to that extent it might be difficult to read. There are like quite a few Nietzsche references, which I didn't quite catch the first time around when I read it, but I caught like a lot more of them now that I've read a lot more Nietzsche, which is interesting. For interest, I gave it a 7, largely on the back of like the kind of raising questions about religion, as well as this notion of Grok and like thinking about relationships. Obviously, I think I mentioned it earlier, there's like, you know, like a free love commune, like kind of towards the end of the book type of thing, which is, you know, it's interesting to think your way through, and also interesting because this book would have been extremely progressive for like 61. Apparently, Heinlein like sat on the book, or the book idea, for like a decade before publishing it, because he thought that the social mores needed to change a bit before he could publish it. And so it was like too progressive for its time. Or progressive is maybe not the right word. Anyways, overall, as far as recommendations go, I would pretty broadly recommend this book as being an entertaining science fiction book on that grounds, as well as just kind of for picking out the concept of Grok. Specifically, if I thought that that would be important to an individual for whatever reason, I might recommend this book. I probably wouldn't recommend it as like the most entertaining story like that I could recommend, but if you wanted science fiction like specifically, this would probably be the one, or like top of what I've read. And so, yeah, as far as discussions go, is there any science fiction books people would recommend? Because I really haven't read that much. I think I've read like Foundations, The Foundation, this Ender's Game. I think I read like Xenocide or something. But I haven't really read that many science fiction books. So if anyone has any recommendations, feel free to throw them in the comments, and do the YouTube stuff, and have a good one.